Thanks everyone for joining us tonight. My name is Susan, and I'm a bookseller at Belmont Books, your host for tonight's Belmont Books virtual event. For those of you who are not familiar with the store, Belmont Books is a locally owned bookstore in Belmont, Massachusetts. We're fortunate to be one of the many independent bookstores nationwide who enrich communities and get books into the hands of eager readers. We know you have book buying options, and we appreciate your support. Both authors' books are, of course, for sale on our website, and we encourage you to support them and Belmont Books and buy the books featured tonight. I'll post links in the chat to make it easy for you. A little housekeeping. First, chat and video will be intentionally disabled. It looks like some of the video is not disabled. I'm going to cut you out. If you are a participant tonight, keep your video the way it is. If you are a guest, please mute your video as well, or I'll do it for you. If you have questions, please send them to me via the chat button below, and we'll get to as many as possible after the discussion. Before we get started tonight, I have a couple of upcoming events I'd like to highlight. This Thursday, May 21st, Allison McGee, author of The Opposite of Fate, will be in conversation about faith, motherhood, and difficult decisions with Mimi LeMay, author of What We Will Become. And next Tuesday, May 26th, we're thrilled to welcome Lily King, author of Writers and Lovers, in conversation with Gish Jen, whose latest novel is The Resistors. We hope you can join us, so please sign up on our website. I'll also have a link there. And now for tonight's event. We are so pleased to welcome Anna Solomon and Laura Zigman. Anna is the author of 3 novels, The Little Bride, Leaving Lucy Pear, and her latest, The Book of V, which was described in the New York Times as engrossing, highly readable, and darkly sexy. Anna's short fiction, essays, and reviews have appeared in the New York Times Magazine, Plowshares, One Story, the Boston Globe, Tablet, and elsewhere. Oops, I lost my instructions when I let people in. Anna is a graduate of Brown University and the Iowa Writers Workshop, and teaches writing at Barnard College and at the Warren Wilson MFA program in creative writing. Anna was born and raised right up the way in Gloucester, Massachusetts, and lives in Brooklyn, New York with her husband and 2 children. Laura Zigman is the author of Animal Husbandry, which was made into the movie Someone Like You, starring Hugh Jackman and Ashley Judd, Dating Big Bird, Her, and Piece of Work. Her latest novel, Separation Anxiety, is a hilarious and heartbreaking portrait of coping when your life is unraveling. She has been a contributor to the New York Times, Washington Post, and the Huffington Post, produced a popular online series of animated videos called Annoying Conversation, was the recipient of a Yaddo residency, and she lives in Cambridge, Massachusetts with her son, husband, and a deeply human Sheltie. Both Anna and Laura are friends of the store, and we're so happy to have them here tonight. I'll turn it over to you guys now.
Okay, now I'm unmuted.
Yep.
I feel so free.
I'm so glad you feel free. I'm sorry.
Laura, are you?
Okay, I'm muted.
Okay, you guys are in. Now I got to get rid of the video on everybody else, and you're off.
Thank you. I'm going to just quickly start. I'm sure I speak for Anna when I thank Belmont Books and Henry Holt and Echo for arranging this great virtual event. We're so glad to be here. Anna and I met in January when the world was a very different place. We were at Winter Institute, which is like nerd prom for independent booksellers. We were in Baltimore, and we were at the same table at a luncheon that was all about how to promote your book. And so, Anna, I think you must have really gotten an A+ that day, because look at you. It's amazing to see. I just finished your novel. It's an incredible book, as everyone says it is. It's one of those books that's hard to ask questions because you don't want to give anything away, but congratulations on the GMA pick and People Magazine Book of the Week, among a million other things. And I just thought I would let you read a short reading, and then I'll ask you a couple questions, and then we'll just go back and forth like that.
Okay, that sounds great. Thank you so much. I have so many thank yous, but I'm just going to jump right in. But I'm going to read, we're both going to read very briefly. We'll just say that right up front. And because, so as we'll talk about, my book they're three women from three very different time periods whose stories intertwine in the book. And I'm going to read from the most contemporary one, in part because she's fun, and in part because in terms of Laura and my books, I think they speak to each other most in these more contemporary moments, both in the content, but also sort of in the sensibility. So this is just very brief. It's from an early chapter. It's about this is my character Lily. She also happens to be another, the character that I sort of have the most in common with, at least in terms of our trappings. She's a mother of two in Brooklyn. And you can just get a feel here. She's trying to get one of her children out of the house, having a very hard time doing it so they can pick up the other child. And she's heading afterwards to this sewing party, which she's sort of gotten herself into by accident a little bit. And she's going to try to see if she can learn how to sew to make costumes for her daughters for a Jewish holiday called Purim. And she feels ambivalent about that, like she does about almost everything else in her life. So here you can just get a flavor for that. Lily finds June standing on the couch holding the Book of Esther above her head like a trophy. This is a children's book. Lily snatches the book away. Her attempt the previous night to throw it out was thwarted by the building's porter, who, having found it in the trash, knocked on their door this morning, cheerful in his blue jumpsuit. "One of your girls make a mistake." Lily wanted to scream. She hates the book, not only because her mother gave it to the girls in her pushy, be more Jewish way, or because the girls quickly grew obsessed with it. She hates the book because after going through 3 stages with it herself, she was entertained briefly, then bored, then bewildered. She's entered a 4th stage in which she recognizes that the embattled Queen Esther, like Lily, is a second wife. Lily drops the book into the dark crevasse behind the couch cushions. Tomorrow afternoon, but not before then, she will dig it out and leave her mother to read it to the girls. Every Thursday, Ruth comes over so Lily can have a little time to herself, though what Lily does with this time, she cannot exactly say. Mostly she walks, sometimes through the park, sometimes through stores, touching things, feeling fizzy and weirdly burdened until the time has passed. Tomorrow, maybe she'll do something more productive, purchase supplies for the girls' dresses, practice the stitches she'll be taught tonight. Ignoring June's squeals, Lily throws her into the stroller and with a knee between her legs manages to strap her in, buckle the tiny injurious buckles and maneuver her out the door. June is shirtless and bootless, but they make it somehow into the elevator, which causes Lily to remember that she was doing laundry in the basement earlier and that her wet sheets are still waiting in washing machines number 1 and number 3. What will the super do with them this time? But time is chugging along, and look, she managed to grab a fresh shirt for June, as well as the boots and also her own coat and hat. And by the time the elevator door opens into the lobby, they are a miracle ready. June smiles sweetly, and Lily pushes them out into the yellowing winter sunlight, and they join the river of other women and strollers and children on 8th Avenue, heading to this school or that, or home from school, or to laundromats, or piano lessons, or nitpickers, or playdates. There are no men to be seen. It is 2016. 4 days into a new year. Lily breathes. The cold air wicks her sweat. The sky is blue. The bare trees make it appear bluer. The skin beneath her eyes appears smooth and bright. She will pick up her other child. She will go to the party. She will learn to sew.
Great. That's great. So I'll let you do this. Just give us the 3 women. You have 3 women, 3 different threads, 3 different periods of time. Tell us who they are and tell us a little bit about why you chose those women in those time periods. It's amazing.
We have Lily, who you heard, who's this, mother of 2, second wife in Brooklyn. She's given up an academic career to raise her kids. She feels very torn about it. She has all sorts of sort of intellectual and sexual frustrations at this point in her life. And she's in this, and she's, struggling with her. There's always this, her mother's always hanging over her head. Her mother is a sort of staunch feminist. And that's sort of what the only way in which Lily knows her to be, and her mother has expressed a lot of passive aggressive disappointment in Lily's choices not to pursue her career. And then there's Vivian Barr, who is a senator's wife. We meet her in 1973, Washington, D.C., so right the Watergate era, Washington, D.C. She is asked for a very humiliating favor by her husband very early on in the book. When she refuses to do it, is banished, so to speak, to Massachusetts, of course, which is actually where I am right now, hiding out from the pandemic, I should say. And her life is changed as she knows it. It's this moment in 1973 in the second wave women's movement where, she's sort of split between convention and sort of the other wives of senators and politicians and powerful men, and this sort of women's liberation groups that she's being drawn into as well. And her story involves sort of which direction she goes, or whether she finds one of those directions suitable to her. And she doesn't want to have children is a big part of her sort of who she is, and this thing that she can't figure out even why that is, but it makes things hard for her. And then we have a teenager named Esther in ancient Persia, whose name you recognize from the biblical book of Esther, who does not want to become queen. So it's sort of a different interpretation. And that storyline kind of is my playing with what how that book may have come to be. A very different story than the one that sort of I was told, at least growing up, on the one that we know. And so the book, every chapter, it weaves between their stories. And I think a good comp, which I, talk about a lot, and a real inspiration for me, is Michael Cunningham's The Hours. On a structural level, there's certain similarities, a lot of differences, but in the sense that I have this original book, which the women in the story are either sort of living out or reckoning with. And like my character, Vivian Barr, represents Vashti, who's the queen in the book of Esther, who's banished immediately. And I chose all of these women because I really wanted to write about and explore how women's lives and choices have and have not changed over time. And so in order to do that, I really wanted to see how these women and their lives would speak to each other.
Yeah, and they do. I'm going to come back to this later, but there are so many issues that are still so contemporary seeming, and they're so relevant now. I think there are a bunch of writers in who are here tonight. And of course, even if we're writers, we read as readers, or, so I was reading this as a reader and also as a writer. And as a writer, I was like, it's hard enough to write a novel with one female character and like one period of time frame. So my head exploded as a writer when I was reading the book, in a good way. But I was like, oh my God, how did you do this? Like, how did you conceive of doing it? And how did you technically do it? Did you have file cards? Did you have a chart? Like, what was your, so we can all take notes and do it ourselves.
I'm super dependent on file cards, actually. And they're like my very high tech approach to structure. But so, yeah, I had a lot of index cards that I used, and I have pictures of it that I've put up on Instagram over the years. I did it kind of part by part. The book is divided into 3 parts, and I would organize them in the way that I thought that the scenes would play out in a given part, and they would be color coded depending on the time period. And then I would start to kind of put on them some of the key objects, gestures, themes that run through the book, like everything from sewing to drinking to humming and so that I could kind of, I think for me, I'm someone who really needs to be able to see something visually in order to be able to grasp it. And, when you're in the midst of writing a scene, you don't really see it. You're just in it. But I needed to have a place where I could put my eyes and be like, okay, here's the weaving, here's how it's going to work. And on a plot level, because their plots do converge in the book, both, throughout the book and very much toward the end and in the final part of the book, you start to see them collide and you start to understand what I'm doing. But to do that was the scariest part to me, because I had never kind of withheld information in that way before for so long in a book. And I think, so that felt like a great achievement to me when my first readers were like, oh, this was so exciting. And I was like, you didn't know? And they were like, no, without getting into it more. But so, yeah, it was like that. And it was very much, I felt it was like, I kept going back and forth between like, this feels like I'm building a building, like an architecture project, though I know nothing about architecture. And this feels like I'm composing a symphony, which I also know nothing about. But, in terms of the difference between, structure and thinking very analytically, and then kind of following my instinct and almost feeling my way through rhythmically. Yeah. It was sort of a back and forth between those modes, I guess.
Yeah. I mean, and just to, validate what you said before. There were these wonderful moments of, you're reading and reading and you're kind of like, how is this going to connect? Or how are you sort of know they are. And when it first starts to happen, it is really magical almost when you're like, oh my God, oh my God. And so you did it really well. How long did it take you to write? When did you start
I
writing?
never know, because like I start and then I stop, and then there's like another book came out in the middle, but I feel like 3 to 4 years is somehow accurate for this one.
Yeah. Um, one of the great parts of the book is the sense of friendship, women's friendships, and just how important they are. I was wondering if you have friends who are writers, or do you have because writer friends are different than actual friends.
Yeah.
For me, no, just kidding. But sometimes they overlap and sometimes they don't. But I was wondering if you have like a whole circle of writer friends that you really rely on.
I do. I have different circles, so to speak, I guess. And I feel like I tend to have sort of in terms of my writer friends, more like individual friends. Two very important people, though, to me have been, and they're both Boston area writers, excuse me, Jane Roper and Heidi Pittler. And I can't even now explain how this happened, but we now have been for years doing these sort of self-made retreats together, where we wind up either finding something to sort of rent, or someone just loans us their home. Once we did it here in my mom's house in Gloucester. And we hole up and we stay as long as we can, and we write all day, and we drink wine and cook for each other at night. And it's like the most nourishing, incredible. And we don't really read each other's work even while we're there. It's not that. It's just like,
you wouldn't be friends. I mean,
right, then it wouldn't even work. It's like there's nothing required except to be there and be present with each other. And that's been a huge gift. Yeah.
That's great. That's great.
Will you read from Separation Anxiety? And
Sure.
then we'll keep the conversation going after too. But I want everybody to hear a little bit of this totally hilarious and somehow also tender novel. I love it. I love it.
I was going to say I will read as long as I can come to the next little Gloucester right away.
Oh, I'm being held hostage.
So I'm just going to read like a page. It's really basically the first page, and it's from the first section is oddly enough, there are 3 sections, and this one, part 1 is called Sheltering in Place. How prescient. But so this chapter is called The Sling. I start wearing the family dog, a mini Sheltie, a little lassie, an unbleached cotton baby sling across the front of my body like a messenger bag, a few weeks shy of fall, until I slip the sling over my head and feel a strange surge of relief run through me, a liquid narcotic from an unknown source. There's nothing special about the day. It's no one's birthday. It's not the anniversary of someone's death or a reminder of an ancient career milestone, long gone and unsurpassed. Nothing in particular is reminding me more than usual of life's quick passage of random moments, some good, some not so good, some very, very bad, disappearing like train cars into the vanishing point of a distant horizon. It's just an opaque Thursday in late August, a month before New England is ready to give up the thick haze of summer, a day I randomly picked to try to radically declutter the basement, using a book everyone is swearing by. The ruthless purging of possessions to the point of self-erasure is what I'm after. I already feel invisible. Why not go all the way? I'm 50 when I head down to the basement. My son is 13. He no longer wears matching pajamas or explains the virtues of buttermilk Eggo waffles compared to homestyle, or holds my hand when we cross the street or walk through a supermarket. He no longer begs for Legos, pulling me into the store at the mall, pointing at all the boxes, jewels on the shelves, gifts waiting to be given. It's hard for me to believe these moments ever happened, that I was ever in the middle of all that love and time and possibility, and that now I'm not. Life eventually takes away everyone and everything we love and leaves us bereft. Is that its sad lesson? That's the only explanation I have for why I now wear the dog. My version of magical thinking. Little tiny cracks are forming inside me every day, and only the dog is keeping me from coming apart completely.
Thank you. It's so great. I love it. It's really a masterful novel opening. I really think it is. I mean, there's all the details that are so great, and I felt a certain amount of sort of anticipatory grief reading this, because I have, like, my son is 7 right now, so he's still like explaining to me the virtues of like this is better, that, you know, just ridiculous things that he's sure that he knows. And anyway, there was that, and there was just this, and the oh my God, the Marie Kondo and the all of it. But I also, the fact that you start, you know, what is the very beginning? I started wearing the dog, right? So you start with the absurd. You put it right out there, and then you're a master of this in your writing generally. But you know, this way of managing to kind of like, well, this is the situation, and allowing the reader to laugh, but also maintaining and developing our connection to this character, and taking Judy. We respect her even as we're laughing at her in moments. And I'm just wondering, I mean, this is a broad question, I guess, but sort of, I don't know, it's not like a what's your trick, but can you talk about that balance for you between the humor and sometimes the snarkiness, and then the kind of tenderness and the earnestness that also runs through your work?
Thank you. I mean, this was really a hard one because I was just so committed to starting it in a place where Judy was really sad, where her life really sucked, and where, you know, my character is 50 and your characters are younger, I think. I mean, Lily is anyway. And there's a part of life when you hit your late 40s and 50s, early 50s. I'm in my late 50s now, but where life really, and this can happen at any time really, but for me it happened in my mid to late 40s and early 50s, where just shit just starts to hit the fan, and it gets really hard, and loss is really the main thing that you're dealing with. You're just trying to keep it together, and every year it's like there's something new horrible that happens. And so for me, autobiographically, that's what was happening. It was like a terrible decade. And so Judy sort of starts in this place. It's like a still point, you know, it's like when you shut your computer off and before it goes back up, it's like, it's dark. And I remember I showed, I think the first 100 pages to a friend of mine, and he was like, does it get funny? And I was like, no, it does get funny. But like right now, you know, it's not that funny. She is, and that's one of the things about being in your 50s is you stop caring. And Judy sort of stops caring. She knows she's absurd. She wears this dog. She wears it to the chagrin of her son. You know, she brings it to his school. She's going to like do one of those parent talks. And he's like, Mom, do you have to wear the dog? And she's like, yep, wearing the dog. She feels like it's the only way she can get through. And her husband's embarrassed, and they're all kind of embarrassed. And she's just kind of like, well, you know what? This is who I am right now. I have to wear the dog. And so even though I never actually wore the dog, I went through periods of time where I was taking care of my parents who were each ill at different points. And I had a dog, and I had the dog with me all the time. I wasn't wearing the dog in a sling, but it was like a therapy animal. And I think for this book too, you know, my past novels were written different time. I was a different person. World was a different place. It was before this election. And it seemed like you could be kind of lighter and more flippant and more glib. And I felt like when I started this book in 2015, but I really didn't get going on it really till 2017, the world was just completely changed. And I felt like I didn't want to be too glib. I wanted there to be real heart to it. And also I know, I don't know if you get this, but if you write humor, you definitely get smacked for being, you know, mean. And you know, people can take humor different ways. And so I just wanted it to have that kind of kindness to it this time around. So.
I think it really does. I think the balance, I think all of it's really in the book, really there. Yeah. I was, so not to rest on, because you wound up speaking a little bit about where this came from for you, you know, there was a long time between your last book and this one. 14 years, is that
yes.
Something like that? Okay. So I'm just wondering, I was reading this interview with you where you talked about a friend at some point describing to you in a way that was helpful, that saying that writer's block was not so much an issue of creativity, but let me just remember, but a quote, avoidance of rejection, which I thought was so interesting. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. I mean, you know, I had 4 novels published, and then I completely stopped writing. My 4th novel didn't do very well, and it just kind of coincided with a lot of stuff that was happening in my life. And I just completely stopped writing. And it took years and years and years later for someone, it's a friend of mine, writer friend of mine named Pamela Painter, who teaches at Emerson. And I was with her and another friend of mine, Alice Hoffman, my writer friends, among other writer friends here. And I was talking, of course, we were talking endlessly about my writer's block, because that's what we, they were always writing. And I was like, oof, ghostwriting. And I think it was Pam who said, well, you know what Norman Mailer said about writer's block. And of course I didn't. And she told me, and she said that he said that it wasn't really about being blocked. It was having a crisis of confidence. And there was something about that little difference. It was sort of like, no, I could write. I'm just choosing not to because I am not confident. I had completely lost my confidence after my fourth novel. And I just had given up. And it's really hard. I mean, as you know, to be back in the fray. I mean, after 14 years, my last book was published in 2006. The world was like completely different. It was no social media to speak of except MySpace. And so it was just a really different thing. And to come back into it after so long is really hard, not just to publish into it, but to write. Like, it's just a hard thing to do. But it is.
I find, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah.
I hadn't even thought about the fact that on the publishing side of things, like that it's like you're entering into a completely different universe. Cause I feel that way 4 years later. I mean, every year it's like completely different landscape.
Right. Well, that's what's really
not
funny.
a bookstagrammer, then what are you doing with yourself?
Right. And that's what's really funny is people say, oh, I've been out of it for so long. My last book was published 3 years ago. And I'm like, try 14. Try before we had a Black president. Try before there was no Instagram, no Facebook, no Twitter, no nothing. And so for years I've been, I was ghostwriting for a long time. I still do ghostwriting, but I was ghostwriting for many years and working for a tech company for a couple of those years and just completely out of it. But all my friends were still publishing and still writing. So I was always on and retweeting and reposting everybody's stuff. And so I sort of knew how things were working. But when it came time for my book to finally come out, like it was just so weird. The first time a librarian, God bless the librarians, posted a picture of my ARC this summer. And I remember exactly where I was. Like I got a little notification on Instagram. It was like my first social media thing. Right. And I was like, oh my God, this is crazy. But yeah, it's just a weird,
weird
new world. Yeah.
And I mean, I find that every time I'm away from my writing self for a while, which I am like right now, I mean, I'm right here, I guess. I'm not going anywhere, but like, I'm not writing right now. I'm like all I can do right now is the promoting and then dealing with children who are trying to somehow school themselves. But I think, I mean, when you're talking that the kind of the self-confidence and I feel like it requires this sort of like, it's very fake it till you make it at first, and very much a sort of like, okay, I'm going to put on the costume of a writer, even if I do not believe today that I can possibly do this, And I think there's so much to be said for that, of just the kind of like, whatever it takes. And if you feel sort of like you're a fraud, then like you might be doing the right thing. Just like keep going. As long as like the fraud that you're being is a writer, you might manage to write a book that way, right?
Exactly. I know. I had a friend who said, I remember at one point people would be like, come on, just do it, just do it. And I had one friend who called me and she was like, listen, just do it. She goes, it doesn't even have to be very good. Just do another book. And I was like, oh, well.
Right.
But there was something in your book, I'm looking at my phone because I can't have it on my screen, but
yeah.
One of my favorite, okay. So one of the things I love so much about all women's issues, so it's friendship and relationship with mothers and kids and all that stuff. It's toward the end of the book, and I'm not giving anything away, but it really spoke and speaks to, I think, what so many of us feel in our lives. We're always trying to be something or be the kind of person we think we're supposed to be, or the kind of woman we're supposed to be. And I mean, one of the great parts of Lily's relationship with her mother is that her mother judges her because she doesn't think she's enough of a feminist. Usually it's like the daughters are judging the mothers, but here Ruth is like, well, why do you just not have a career anymore? But I'm quoting you, I'm quoting Lily, I think. What if it's easier than she imagines? If she could simply decide right now to be done with the way she is, done with discontent and done with her mother's voice and maybe done with her friends too and their cult of ambivalence? What if she could simply want what she has? It's like the most profound line. What if she could simply want what she has? And then a few lines later, she goes on to say, she is too old to believe that she's going to somehow wind up being someone she hasn't already become. And there's so much in those few lines that I thought was just completely resonated for me, and I'm sure for so many other people, but that cult of ambivalence, which I totally got. And then just that feeling of, why can't you just want what you have? And I just thought that was incredibly profound.
Thank you. Yeah, it's a line that a lot of people have connected with for, I think, obvious reasons, because, and I think that it runs through the book. I mean, it's interesting as I hear from readers understanding how much runs through all three stories around this, like, and really the book is sort of about like where the gaps between the stories that we're told about ourselves and then the stories we wind up living, you know, like, and I think as women in particular, we're so familiar with this because we're constantly just being bombarded with images and storylines and the ideas of like, well, you can be this type of woman or you can be that type of woman. And it's like, well, wait a second, I don't feel my experience isn't matching any of this. And out of that then comes all this shame for us, for a lot of women, I think. And so, yeah, yeah. It was.
I can relate to that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Especially when Lily is trying to sew the costumes for Purim, and she can't sew, and it becomes this whole thing throughout the book of her trying to get these costumes, dresses sewn. And I remember when my son was in preschool a million years ago, I decided I wanted to be the kind of woman who was going to bake Martha Stewart's gingerbread house. So it was a mansard Victorian, it was an extremely extensive recipe. And I wrote about it for the New York Times. I was like, can a person like me who can barely bake one of these like crazy houses? And the answer was like, no. But I really wanted to be that person. Like I actually did it and brought it into the preschool, and then people were jealous because they thought it was a whole thing. But I really felt for Lily, that feeling of like, she's really trying, but it's really not who she's ever going to be.
No. And I mean, I think that's why I enjoy, it's in your book. And you feel the way in which Judy, like she's in a place where her roles, right? So she has these roles as wife and as mother, and they're all like, they've all gone flat. Like there's no, she's not getting anything from them. And she's like, it's like I feel like she's trying to sort of figure out like what her role is going to be without the roles that she's played, you know, and in that same way it ties into kind of like, well, what woman is she going to be? Like what role will there be for her? Right. I don't know. One thing I wanted to ask you about, because you very explicitly will call your work to some degree, you know, you'll say like it's semi-autobiographical, which is not something I've ever done. But in this book, Lily is the closest to myself that I've written before in terms of like, you know, I've mentioned that. And I'm just wondering, so this is like my asking advice, I guess, but so when someone asks you, I'll ask you, Laura, so how much is Judy yourself? Or even worse, right? So this scene that I loved, was that real? You know, like, so how do you approach that as, you know, when you're doing these kinds of events?
That's a really good question, especially this one, is because it's so focused on a marriage that is coming apart, or we think. And so, you know, like you said, I mean, almost everything I've written comes from a starting point of autobiographical, a situation or a phase that I'm going through. So my first novel was about getting dumped. And all of my other novels were sort of about different aspects of life that either I was going through or friends of mine were going through. And this, you know, again, when you hit 50 or your late 40s, or even before that, you know, marriages start to really show their strengths and their weaknesses. And so one of the things for Judy is the sense of shame. There's one of the epigrams at the beginning of the book is by Esther Perel, the great couple. She's a psychotherapist and she has a great podcast, but she says that, you know, probably in the 60s and 70s or before that even, people felt a sense of shame when they got divorced. And now we feel a sense of shame if we stay in our imperfect marriages. And I think Judy definitely has this sense of shame. She feels like her marriage sucks. It's weird. Her husband has an anxiety disorder. She's weird. He's weird. They're both weird. They have no friends because no one can deal with them. And they're kind of embarrassed. Like, you know, Gary is kind of out there with his anxiety. And so it's hard for them, as it is hard to keep friends as a couple. I wrote a piece a long time ago for the New York Times about how hard it is to just find couples that you can be friends with. You usually like 3 of the 4 work, and there's always that one. It's either the husband or the wife. Like, maybe it's us, but it's always us. But so it's hard enough to keep
It's always the husband. Sorry.
But it's hard enough to kind of keep couple friends and make couple friends when your kids are little, and then you get to a point where your kids aren't little anymore, and then you lose some of your friends. And so anyway, Judy and Gary are like, it's easier for them to, they're not joiners. They never joined a temple. They didn't do this. They didn't do that. So they're kind of on their own, and that puts even more pressure on them to kind of feel like they just don't mesh anymore. And so she's really ruled by a lot of shame. Like she's got the shame about the marriage, the shame about her career. She was a children's book writer. And of course, so there's little threads, like everybody has a marriage that isn't perfect. And we all wonder, like, should we stay, should we go? And with my career, I mean, it was just a tremendous amount of shame in a way after, you know, have 4 novels published, and people would run into me at the supermarket and go like, what happened to you? You know, it was just, and, you know, you can't really answer that in a quick question, and even though I wasn't really truly ashamed, there is a sense of like, well, what did happen? And I think Judy feels a real sense of like mourning that her career is gone and her son is growing up, and she's sort of pre-mourning him, and then her best friend is dying. So like, again, like it does get funny, but there are all these really big sort of impending losses that are coming. And those were all things that I was dealing with. I had both my parents got sick and passed away. I had several good friends who died, but one in particular who I dedicated the book to, Lisa Boncheck Adams, who died in 2015, who a lot of people knew. She had breast cancer and wrote a lot of stuff. She was very well known. So there was just a lot of stuff roiling that was so relevant to me that I really wanted to work it into, and relevant to so many people, I think, in my circles. Yeah.
Right. So you've done a very good job. You answered my question, but didn't get deeply into your own personal experience. I know I'm learning from you. This is good. This is good. I love it. I just think, yeah, it's an interesting balance. But you also brought up what I think, I mean, we were already talking about this, but how both of our works are so engaged with this question. And maybe this is just, well, I think it's what good novels do, is that you're helping, or not helping, but you're investigating in some way that space between sort of what we imagined our lives would be like, or what we think they should be like, and what they feel like to be living them. I mean, I think that's why we become readers. At least that's why I became a reader as a kid, was that I would read the books that I loved. I would read and I would find like, oh, someone else has these feelings. Oh, I'm not alone, right? I mean, what a moving experience, and totally profound. And then you might at some point sort of decide you want like to make something that someone else feels that way about. And it's such a huge gift. So
I love that. I love that, how you describe that, because it really is. And I think Lily feels that, and Judy definitely does, a sense of like, this is not what was supposed to happen. And our lives are like that. I mean, there was a moment when I sort of woke up and I was like, and that's what I think is really interesting too, is like, you know, and this is what I want to ask you about. I read or heard, I think, that you scrapped like 100 pages of your novel. You went down a path and it didn't work out. And what I find so fascinating is that people who would look at you as an accomplished novelist, especially with this, and say, you know, they can't imagine that you would have gone down a rabbit hole that didn't work out. Like they just assume, you know, and they assume, and we all assume, like when I had 4 novels out, now you just assume you're just going to keep going. Like you reach a level of success and it's just going to continue. And that's not, life isn't like that. You know, it's fluid. Success is fluid, failure is fluid. It's all like, but I wonder if you would talk about that, because I think it is so inspiring. I know, again, there are writers in here, and tell us what that was like. Like, was it your agent, the lovely Julie Bear? Was she the one who said, not working, or was it your editor? And like, how did you deal with that?
I feel like I can't. There are so many pieces of this book that changed in such drastic ways. There was one scene in particular. So one thing was that the entire Esther part in Persia, I think it was the first. I wrote 140 pages of the book, which was interwoven, so it wasn't all Esther. And I actually showed that to a couple reader friends, and I was sort of off. They were like, they gave me critiques, but they were also like, good to go, good to go. And I don't know if this is what you're referencing, but I came back to that myself, and I was like, this sucks. This thing that's happening in Esther, I mean, in Persia is just wrong. And I don't know what needs to happen here, but like, I know that my readers said this was working, but they are wrong. And like, oh no, and I really did go back to sort of nowhere with it. And it was, it's pretty despair inducing. And then, and sort of, I had to kind of take some time, I think, just to be reading and doing other things, so that like I had to put it into my sort of subconscious for a while before it kind of came to me what needed to happen. And part of that was actually related to magic, which I had not imagined writing. I haven't written really like Esther has magical powers, and it wasn't something that I started out this project being like, she's going to have magical powers. It happened kind of organically. And then there was the other thing about that was in this book, that was just a smaller portion, but I guess this might have been what you heard me talking about was, and because it would have been hundreds of pages, is I rewrote, there was a chapter that was supposed to take place late in the book, and I must have rewritten it like at least 20 times. It was like 10 pages long, but that many times. And it was just like, it was just awful. And in the end, it was my editor was like, I just don't think you need it. And I was like, oh.
After all that.
And literally I took, now in the very final chapter, there are 2 sentences that get across the information that I was, that's one of those things I think, the more, like, you think that you do it enough that like, you would know after the 5th try to maybe say to yourself, maybe you don't need this, but no, like it still just had to keep going and going.
So
yeah.
fun.
I don't know.
It's not funny, but it's funny.
It is. Well, it is funny in retrospect when it all works out, but when you're in the middle of it, you're just like, oh my God. You do think you would learn. Yeah. Was there one part of this book for you writing it that was like either the most difficult or where it felt very different from books that you've written before on a process level?
Well, it's funny. I decided that I was going to try to write another novel. And so I also wanted to try to work on a memoir. And so I liken the process of trying to write a memoir and this as, when I graduated from college, a friend of mine, my best friend at the time, made us go on a whale watch. We went out of Provincetown. And I'm not an adventurous person. I don't like boats. I like to be near the water. I don't want to be on the water. And so we went out on a whale watch, and it was like Moby Dick, out for 20 minutes, the skies change, huge storm, terrifying. I get the one bathroom in the whale watch boat. And I was sick the entire time. It's just awful. I'm still talking about it 30 years later. But the boat, like the whole thing was like the boat made 2 distinct motions. Like one motion was chugging to find the whale, which made me very sick. And I would say, oh my God, please stop and let's look at the whale. And then we would stop and look at the whale and sway, and I'd be like, oh my God, let's find another whale. So that's like the memoir, the novel, the memoir, the novel. I'd be working on the memoir, and I'd be like, oh my God, I hate this. I'm going to work on the novel. Then I'd get to the novel, I'd be like, oh my God, it's so much worse. Go back to the memoir. So that went on for like several years. And finally, I kind of gave up on the memoir, and I just went full steam ahead in the novel. And it was funny because once I finally pushed past a certain point, like it took a really long time to get it going, and I kept getting stuck and not really knowing whatever. Then I worked on it for so long, and so I ended up going over it so many times in a way that I hadn't in my previous novels, that I just, that was the difference. I think if something made me cringe, if there was a sentence or a paragraph, normally I would be just like, just
right.
Yuck. But I would and this was like, oh no.
It's really finely tuned. You can feel that. I see.
Yes, me too. There she is.
I was just thinking, we have, people have questions, I bet, or I hope.
Yeah, we do have a few questions. You guys are doing such a great job. I think everyone is just kind of mesmerized here. I'm going to kind of sort these out a little bit. I just want to let you know that Jessica Kane is in the audience tonight, author of Rules for Visiting.
Love
And she
Jessica.
says, congratulations to both of you, and she loved your novels. So just wanted to let you know that particular
Love
comment
Jessica's
was
novel.
directed at both of you.
Love her novel.
Yes, it's beautiful.
So let's see. Linda Wertheimer, also a writer in the audience, is asking Anna, Purim to even the most non-religious Jews is a well-known, accessible holiday, but it's not necessarily so known to non-Jews, especially ones I grew up with in a small town. Anna, was this an initial challenge or concern for you, how to take this very Jewish story and give it mainstream appeal? You have clearly done that, but curious about your thoughts about it during the writing.
Oh, that's a great question. I probably should have been more worried about it. This was actually something I was interested in as I was thinking about Laura's work as well, and in the sense that I think both of us are like, there's a clear Jewishness, there's a Jewish sensibility, but there's some way in which it's not like, there's not a narrowness to it, I think. And I think that that's tended to be my approach even in my other books as well, even though they've all involved Jewish themes or Jewish characters in one way or another. And not, without getting into sort of the psychodynamics of why that is, I think that I was interested in, I really didn't want readers to have to know anything about the Book of Esther, the holiday of Purim, to read this book and be totally immersed in it and care about the characters. And so for me, it's always a question, I think it's the same question always, which is, has to be about these characters and their stories and the details of that. Not that they're not important, but they're sort of, they're like I guess it's the difference between the situation and the story, but that like I wanted to make, you needed to care about these characters in a way that was completely separate from your understanding of the details of that story. And I also, one thing I was very conscious of was allowing, like, Lily is a kind of a great vehicle, because she's so neurotic and so sort of conscious of the ways in which she hates this story and hates this book, that it gave me a chance for her to kind of get out the details in a way, like, so I kind of used that to my advantage. Like at the sewing party, when the other women who are not Jewish, they're like, so tell us about Esther. And then she's like, oh, well, it's kind of like this burlesque and there's this bad guy. And it kind of gave me a chance to be like, if I had to summarize this story in like 10 seconds, all the greatest hits that anybody would be interested in, which is like drunkenness, body stuff going on, sex, etc. Like, I'm just going to get it out there. I'm going to explain how, like, all the parts that are juicy, and just kind of let it be out there in that way, and let that consciousness of people in the story who don't know the story be there, if that makes sense. But I did just, and I'll wrap up, but I did also, the very, very first chapter in the book is very short. It's like 2 pages long, and it's Lily. The first line is close the book, close the book. She's reading to her kids. And I think of it as like a preface, or sort of almost a primer on Purim. And that was the only chapter that I didn't write the first time through in order. I added that for this purpose of trying to allow in kind of, it's for the reader as much as it is for Lily's kids. It's like, okay, here's the deal in very basic terms. It's Esther for children, but it's also Esther for like everybody who doesn't actually know the story. Let's dumb it down and get it out of the way.
That sounds good. Linda says, thank you. You answered it perfectly. So Anna, I'm going to get to another question that's kind of for Laura and Anna. In that conversation that Laura was having about losing confidence, Amy, no, I'm sorry, it was Sadhana had asked Laura, how did you get out of your crisis of confidence? Because so many of us go through this in various ways. And when you were talking about that, I was really thinking also about Anna's book and about, what's the V in the 70s, right? What's her name, Anna?
Vivian Barr. V
Vivian,
is,
yeah,
yeah.
V.
It's called V.
And just thinking about her and her foray into feminism and trying to like to be all of these different kinds of characters. You know, she has her women's group, and then she's got these senators' wives groups, and how she's not confident in any of those places, and she doesn't find herself until you know, she makes a bold move, right? And I was just hoping you could both talk about, losing confidence and gaining confidence in your real lives and also in your fictional characters. You
Yeah,
want
I
to start?
mean, for me, it's like I've never been the most confident person alive. Some people are just naturally, or they appear to be really naturally confident. I never was, and that was all also part of, I think, my charm was like, oh, I'm so unconfident. Look at me trying to do this thing. And when I started out my career as a book publicist. I worked for Random House for 10 years and at Knopf for the last 3 or 4 years of my time in New York. And I remember I was always writing, and I didn't really talk to my authors about it because I felt very strongly that it was like, their time and all that. But there were times, especially at Knopf, I mean, we just had incredible writers, incredible books we were publishing. But every now and then there was a really lousy book. And I would always take that book and I would say to myself, wow, Knopf is publishing this like one kind of not so great novel. I can do that. Like I would look at my shelves and I was like, I'm not aspiring to do those things. Like, I mean, I worked with all of the great fiction writers. So many of them were my authors and stuff. And I mean, I never had like the crazy, like, oh, I just was like, I would look at a really bad book and I would think, I can do this. I can write a bad book. And I also was always motivated by the sense of stupider people than me. So like whenever I've tried, like I once willed myself to write a screenplay. And I was like, look, stupider people than me have written screenplays. I'm going to get a book and I'm going to read about it and I'm going to figure it out. And so I did. And I think every time, I would start a novel or work on something, I would, it always feels like the first time. It always feels like I'm a fraud. It just like when I was a publicist and I would start on a book, when I would be publicizing, I'd always think like, now I'm going to get fired. Now I've worked on 300 books, but no, this is the time. But it's the same thing. I've just finished this book and now I'm trying to start something new. And it's like, I can't, I feel like I'll never do it again. And that's how it feels every single time. And I guess you just have to go through that slog through that mud of feeling like you don't know what you're doing. You've never done it before. Just because you did it doesn't mean you can do it again. All those thoughts. And it's I think that's the hard, makes the actual writing almost easy. It's that mental.
Do you think that that's unique to women, or do you think that we all do that some way? I mean, I guess I hear women talk about it more.
I have not heard a dude say that. I mean, maybe I just know other dudes, but I think a lot of it is, I'm joking, I'm sure a lot of men do have those kinds of insecurities, but I think for the most part, men have a certain baseline of confidence. I mean, there's so many jokes about it on Twitter, like, oh, if I had this guy's, they have no experience doing anything and yet they're experts. And we don't have that baseline, like our glasses, for the most part, I'll speak for myself. My glass is always empty or just like a tiny bit of liquid in there. And I think we all start with a different baseline depending on how you're raised, what your family was like and all that. But for the most part, I feel like women often feel like they don't deserve or they don't have the experience that they clearly do have. So, Anna.
And I wonder, I mean, I always kind of imagine too that it's not as much, again, maybe this is my thing, like maybe not necessarily reflective of the actual experience people have inside, but the way that they allow themselves even to know that experience. Like if you are, because I mean, if you're a man, I'm thinking of men that I know and love, and you have those feelings, like, can you even admit to yourself that you have them, let alone speak about them in the bookstore, like at the event, like, is it done? And I think about, I mean, the ways in which I'm appalled at the ways in which my 7-year-old son, like, talks about things that he has no clue about. I mean, it's wild. Like, I hear him on these Zoom calls with his 2nd grade class being like, did you know that in the jungle there is one king cobra? Like, and then, I don't know, I'm just sort of, and then I have a 12-year-old daughter and it's like very different, and it's painful too. It's like, how, this is clearly still happening. We're not, which is sort of the idea around my book, is like there are actual lived experiences, and especially our internal experiences really we're not coming that far. Yeah, I mean, I think about this all the time, and I think it's weird because I feel like I don't feel like I really gain confidence, but I gain faith. I feel like I have gotten, I've just developed more faith, and that may be the only difference between me now and when I was starting my first novel. And I also, like, my goal the first time, I was like, I just want to go for, I was like, I just need a beginning and an end and to try to get there. Like, I was just like, just let's see if I can do it, you know? And I knew I set myself out a very, you know, clear cut one narrative, you know, it was like, just like, I just have to see, can I do this? You know, that was the question. It wasn't like, will it be amazing? It was just like, can I do it? So it changes. I think the faith part is what changes, because it's like, oh, I've been here before where this all felt impossible and I felt really stupid and I felt this and then I wrote the book anyway. So maybe it's going to be okay. Again.
And are you talking about religious faith or faith in yourself?
No, just faith in myself. I don't really have very much religious faith.
Yep.
For better or for worse.
Pride.
I have ritual and in you know, and in mindfulness, I guess, but yeah, no, more I just mean like faith in the process. Yeah.
Laura, Amy would love to know how you came up with the sling idea. Like, how did that, what was the first time you came up with the sling idea? She says it resonated with her so much because she loved carrying her kids around.
Yeah, I mean, I think that is one of the moments for me that was magical. We have, so if we're writing, most of the time, it's really hard. And there are lots of times, as we've been discussing, where you don't have the faith in yourself, you don't think you can do it, or it's just really hard, or you're lost, you don't know. And then every now and then you have a moment where something just comes to you and it is like magic. And so even though I never wore my dog, I think I was writing about Judy, who was going through so many of the experiences that I had gone through. You know, when you watch, you know, I had two parents who were ill, and I watched from cancer, different kinds and different time periods. And when you go through that, as so many of us have, and you watch that and you are part of that, it's just, you enter like a parallel universe. And for me, in that parallel universe, you know, I would spend the day with either one of my parents when they were going through this. And I would come home and I always had my dog. Like when my mother was sick, that was in 2010, and our dog was really small. And I took my dog with me all the time. We'd take her to Dana-Farber where my mother was getting treated, and I would leave the dog in the car, and then I would come out, take a break and walk the dog or whatever. So I never actually wore my dog, but I had this sense of, at the end of these terrible, difficult days, that are those days when you're watching somebody that you love sort of disappearing, you know, I had this dog, and that became the thing. And for Judy, that's the thing. It's like, she's been through all the loss. Now her son is you know, getting older, and all this stuff is happening. And it's like, somehow that kind of alchemy just happened when I thought, she's going to wear that dog, and how weird will that be? And, you know,
it's funny because you both talked about seeing or how I think, Laura, you were saying that you write a little bit closer to your personal experiences, and that Anna, that maybe Lily was as close to personal as you've written. And I, you know, like what Amy was just saying, you know, she sees herself in some of these characters. And can you both talk just a little bit before we have to go tonight about what it feels like to open yourself up in this way? I mean, you know, Anna, you're talking about sex in some pretty graphic terms in some of the scenes, and marriage, and the challenges that we face. Can you talk about what it's like to bury yourself like that? Even if it's not your story, you're still bearing something that you think about.
And certainly you're bearing something that people assume is your story. Yeah, someone texted me the day there when that New York Times, and it was something like, so you wrote about rote marital sex, huh? You know, and you're like, you know, sorry, honey. It's just that there's something sort of like, it makes me feel less protective of myself and more sort of the people around me, I think. But for me, it felt very freeing to write closer to myself than I have before. It was harder for me on a story level because I figuring out her story was much harder because she was closer to me. And my story is a big muddle because it's life, right? So I had to shape it in a way that was somehow less natural than shaping my other character stories who had so much clear distance from me. But I also really loved the getting to kind of comment on my circles and on contemporary culture and writing. I mean, yeah, I think that I'll end there because I know we need to wrap up, but.
No, thank you very much. And I think we will wrap up here. I just want to thank everybody for coming tonight. I've put the links to both Anna's and Laura's books in the chat tonight, and we encourage you to go to Belmont Books and buy the books. One of the things that all of these authors are experiencing during this this pandemic is that there's not an opportunity to meet people face to face. And so it's really great to be able to have people join us from near and far. And we really hope that you'll buy their books and support the authors and support independent bookstores.
Can I say one thing about that?
Yeah.
Which is really just, even if you're, I mean, I hope you'll buy our books tonight, but I also like buy something from Belmont Books because we want our stores to be here when this is over. We want to all be able to walk into them again so bad.
Yes.
How important they are to us and our communities. And so please, please, please do that because, you know, like Susan works right now, like this is all they're working. This is her work and none of this is free. So thanks.
Yes, agree. Thank you for having us.
Thanks,
Yeah.
everyone. Be safe, be careful with each other. Take good care.
Thank you.